Hi, Recipes for a Sweet Life. I'm Julia Usher. Welcome back. By now you probably know I've been on a kick of minimizing icing cleanup and mess when it comes to decorating cookies. And how do I do that? I often do that by making embossed cookies that have beautiful texture and depth in their own right. And I have one such project for you today. It's this woodland-themed cookie box that is embossed in a number of areas. It's embossed along the sides using a wood grain mat. In addition, all the elements down the front, the flowers and the ferns, are embossed as well. I just want to point out one of my favorite embossed items on this cookie, and it's the fern. It's part of a Wilton mat that includes ferns in various configurations and styles, as well as butterflies and dragonflies. I'll be working exclusively with the ferns. One of my favorite mats. What's also special about this project in this video is that it's part of a collaboration with several of my YouTube friends who are working with Wilton mats as well. Wilton has a large collection of mats that are typically used for embossing fondant and gum paste, but I, of course, will be working with them to shape and emboss cookies today. So here we go. Okay, so what do we need for this project? It's basically a 6-cookie project for the box itself. We'll need 2 half cylinders about 4 inches in diameter, embossed with a wood grain texture for the sides and a 4 3/4 inch base that's also been embossed for the bottom of the box. And then for the top, there are 3 pieces: a stopper top made with a cool plaque cutter, which we'll talk about in a sec, an embossed, a domed piece that's going to sit on top of a 4 3/4 inch round to form the lid with topper. In addition to the box pieces, we've also got a number of accessory cookie pieces, namely those ferns from that Wilton mat that's part of this collaboration video. I've got those in 2 colors. Some sunflowers using a first impressions mold, and some smaller flowers, again using a first impressions mold, and some fondant berries. Let's talk first about how to shape all the unusual pieces, namely the contoured sides of the box. I'm embossing the dough with a wood grain mat, the source of which you'll find in the video description, and I start by rolling my gingerbread in the general shape and direction that I want it to be, and then I roll it to about a 1/8 inch thickness on the mat itself with no flour whatsoever on the mat. I find that too much flour can get caught in the dough and be difficult to remove, and the mat removes just fine without any additional flour. Now I'm cutting directly on my silicone mat rolling surface so I don't have to move the dough too much, but the surface of the mat has been well floured so I can get that piece off without too much difficulty in the end. Marking off the height of the dough in 2 spots at 2 7/8 inch, and then cutting with a ruler to form a straight, clean edge. I'm going to be draping that over my 4-inch cake ring, and I've got my cake ring mounted or supported in another cookie cutter. This way it won't roll when I bake it in the oven. It's going to be baking on its side at 375 for about 10 minutes or until lightly browned around the edges. Similarly, for the domed lid, I'm going to texture with the same mat, but I'm going to start by cutting out about a 4.5 inch round, and the dimensions of this will be in the video description. And I'm going to gently drape that over the back side of a Pyrex container, and again, it hasn't been treated in any way, greased or floured. It will come off quite easily once baked. Patting it ever so gently, not to press out any texture, but to conform it to the sides of the container, and then cutting a 1/4 inch hole at the top for the stopper. As for the stopper, I'm using a cookie cutter kingdom cutter, a plaque cutter that's 1 by 3 inches. I think it's beautiful, but I want it to come to a point at the bottom so it fits into the hole in the lid. So I'm just going to take my chef's knife here and cut it at an angle here at the bottom and bake it 10 minutes, 375 or until lightly browned around the edges. Okay, so now it's time to accentuate that wood grain texture. We're going to go from plain dough to something that's much more dramatic. But first I want to make sure that my sides come together with a nice fit before I do much decorative work on them. And if they're not cleanly coming together, you can take your microplaner and file the sides as I'm doing here, just to make sure that they're a nice, tight, even fit. They don't have to be perfect because we're going to be eventually covering that seam with cookie flowers and ferns, but it's nice to have a good start on it. First part of texturing is to intensify the knots in the wood and certain elements of the wood with black food coloring. This is actually my liquid gel food coloring thinned with a little bit of water, and where it's too heavy and too black, I'm actually patting it off with a little bit of paper towel. This is just going to add a little bit of extra depth and dimension. The second step is to take a relatively thick cream-colored or ivory-colored royal icing and spread it into those grooves to highlight them. And I like to use a really flexible spatula as opposed to a stiff one like this. The flexible one just makes it easier to get that icing into the grooves. And we're going to slather it all over the outside of each half. It doesn't have to be particularly neat at this point, but before the icing dries, you're going to want to take the edge of the spatula and take off all the excess back down to the wood grain to really expose those lines and that nice texture. Sometimes I'll take a clean hand, the palm of my hand, and wipe it flat as well if there are a lot of track marks. We'll just continue in this vein doing both sides. And then my third step of texturing is to lightly dust to give it some shimmer, because every cookie looks better with shimmer, with luster dust. The key here is not to dust too soon, as I think I did here. If the icing's wet, the dust kind of clumps together rather than dispersing nice and evenly and lightly. Another way to add sheen is with a little bit of luster spray. Here I'm using a PME bronze spray. I'm going to do a little bit of both here, both the dust and the spray, to give added depth and dimension. I'm also going to spray just solidly with the bronze spray the topper piece and the base of the lid, both sides. This will just make it look more like a metal box. Okie dokie, about those cookie accessories that are going to close the seam of the box. I have a whole video about how to emboss cookie flowers, make cookie flowers in embossed pieces, and these ferns are no different. I'm simply pressing tinted sugar cookie dough into the mold. I'm going to bake in the mold in this case because it's oven proof, and when the cookies are done, I'm going to pop them out and trim off any excess that's overflowing the edges of the mold. Same process with the flowers. These are slightly deeper molds, so I can get them in to the edges of the flower much more neatly. There's less flowing over the edges of the mold, so they'll likely require less trimming once inverted from the molds and out of the oven. And again, I'll bake in the molds whenever I can because this gives the cleanest, crispest impressions as opposed to pressing the dough into the molds, inverting it, and then baking the dough out of the mold. For added depth and dimension, I'm going to dust the centers of my sunflowers with a little old rose petal dust. Then I'm going to take a cut down sponge brush and sponge the high points of the center, just the high points, with a mixture of bronze luster dust and extract. That creates kind of a paint that I can sponge on. One non-cookie element on this box are fondant berries, and I'm going to quickly show you how to make those. I've simply got red berry-colored fondant here. And I'm going to show you two different ways for creating that stem-like impression on the end. The rolling of the berry is a no-brainer. It's just like shaping a ball of Play-Doh. These are about 1/4 inch berries, and in here I am working with my fondant tool to create the stem type impression, or you can take a star tip. This is number 25 star tip or 27 star tip, and create a similar kind of effect with that if you don't have that particular fondant embossing tool. Lastly, I'd like to create more dimension on these berries, a little depth and texture, by painting on some highlights. This is black food coloring mixed with water. And it's going to dry a lot lighter than it appears when it's freshly painted, but you can always blot off any excess. Okie dokie, we're ready to assemble the box. And once again, you want to make sure that there's a nice fit along the sides. We filed them down earlier. Actually, I may have pulled a different piece than I was working with earlier because it doesn't look to fit quite as nicely, but I'm not going to worry about that because that's going to be covered with flowers. Now I'm just going to take my thick royal icing glue. Again, the thicker the icing, the faster it dries. I'm going to apply it to the bottom of the boxes and also to the side seams and stick them together on the base and allow that to dry. I don't need too much drying time, maybe a few minutes before I can start applying the flowers. But before I do that, I'm going to trim out the bottom with a thick royal icing and a number 25 star tip. This is a shell border. The motion here is to push, pull back, push, pull back, push, pull back. And while that icing's still wet so it serves as glue, I'm going to start by anchoring my larger cookie pieces up the side seam. I'd like to start with the larger pieces to get a sense of the design and then come back in and fill in the holes with the smaller pieces like berries, smaller cookie flowers. And we're going to even be putting some dragées on here, some gold sugar beads for a little bit of added shine and shimmer. As a word of caution, it's best to use as thick an icing as possible when gluing on these pieces. Mine are sliding around a little bit here. I think I could have a slightly thicker icing glue, but I'm going to try to make this work. Again, the thicker the icing, the faster it will set, and the less likely these heavy pieces will be to slide around as you're working on the design. Now I'm going to come in with my smaller accent flowers, these red ones, to fill in holes. I've got some blunt edges on my ferns exposed that I don't like. And I'll either tuck berries in and around those blunt edges or fill in with sugar beads, even some icing leaves. But for now, I'm going to just tuck some berries in and around the edges here. This is nothing more than a pasting technique with a thick royal icing glue. In go those dragées I promised. I love a little sparkle, and I think the gold looks wonderful with these rich autumn colors. And then last touch is going to be some royal icing leaves. I'm using a 349 leaf tip. You could use a larger 350 or 352 if you wanted. And I'm specifically targeting areas where there are gaps behind the big flowers to fill those out so that the box views nicely from all sides, and also covering those blunt fern ends so that you can't see them. And that completes one side of the box. Of course, you'd want to do the exact same thing on the other side to hide that seam. Okay, on to the lid assembly. As you recall, I sprayed the bottom part of the lid with the bronze spray, and I since iced it with the burnt orange icing and trimmed it out with beadwork and allowed it to completely dry. So now I'm ready to assemble. Again, using my thick royal icing glue, applying it to the bottom of the domed textured piece. I textured this piece exactly the same way I textured the sides, first by applying a little bit of black food coloring, then filling in the grooves with the ivory icing, and then lastly coming in and highlighting with luster dust and luster spray. I'm going to trim it out, same way I trimmed out the bottom with my star tip and a thick royal icing. Again, you want a thick icing whenever you're working with textured tips because you want the icing to hold its shape. Beginning once again with my anchor pieces, I'm going to use two different fern pieces going in different directions and different colors here. And then come back in with maybe just a single flower. I don't want to go too crazy with design elements on the lid because I have a lot going on the bottom and I don't want it to look too competitive with the base. As I'm looking at this piece, it kind of reminds me of a fall hat. If we weren't to put the stopper in, it would make a really cute fall hat cookie. Imagine it too in spring colors. So lots of possibilities here. More bling in the form of sugar beads. And now to put in that stopper, the best way to get it anchored quickly is to secure it not only with royal icing glue, but also a little blob of fondant. And I'm going to push the stopper, the pointed end of the stopper, into the fondant, and that's just going to allow it to stand upright on its own more quickly without the need for additional props. I do, however, want to conceal that fondant at the bottom, and that's where these berries are going to come in handy. I'm just going to glue a few around the base to conceal it and maybe pipe in some additional royal icing leaves. We'll also want some leaves around the flowers and the ferns at the base of the lid to conceal any blunt ends and also to fill any big holes behind some of the bigger flowers. And ta-da, there you have it. Fill the box with candy. I wouldn't do this until the box had completely set though. Allow it at least a few hours before you load it up. Okay, so now that my box is all dry, I usually let it dry about 24 hours to make sure that I can securely place the lid on the bottom. We're ready to do something with it. And what would you do with this special treat? It obviously makes a nice party favor, a special gift for a friend, a single standalone element, but you could also make many of them and couple them together to make a centerpiece or a beautiful addition to a harvest sweets table. Today I'm just simply going to fill it up with some chocolate candies and let my husband enjoy it when he gets home. Till next video, live sweetly.